Well, folks, thank you so much for being here. I must confess that I was a little bit naughty this morning. It's a propensity I have. Yes. Un enfant mal élevé, as they would say in French. I decided to do a terrible pun. To title my sharing of ideas, I put the 10% solution. Now, I wanted to talk to you about the tithe, which is usually considered to be 10%. But a phrase came into my mind from Sherlock Holmes. Do you remember the Sherlock Holmes stories? Dr. Watson and Sherlock Holmes. Sometimes when Dr. Watson went into Sherlock's room, he found a syringe by the great detective, from which he deduced that the detective had taken a shot, a 10% solution of cocaine, as a matter of fact, to help him in his lucubrations. There's a word for you. Lucubrations. 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 Something going on up here. Whether the 10% solution helped Sherlock or not, I don't know, but he was apparently quite a frequent user. The Victorians, I hate to say this, were heavily addicted to drugs. Did you know that? Even Queen Victoria, bless her dear heart of sainted memory, was an indulger. Indeed, when I was growing up in England, when I was a child, my parents used to send out to the local druggist, to the chemist, as they called him, for a little green bottle, which contained some green liquid. And that green liquid was opium. And I can assure you that there's another word for you, a fractious child who is given a teaspoonful of opium will be very quiet for 24 hours. Mercifully and thankfully, I have put that past behind me. And the 10% solution of which I am thinking is indeed the tithe. People have asked me to talk about tithing because we in Unity do teach and advocate tithing. We say it's a great idea. So let me explore some notions about tithing with you this morning. Let me be clear that Unity teaches tithing, but it doesn't, of course, require it. But to find out about the origins of tithing, you have to go back a long way, at least 400 or 500 years before Jesus. And you can, in our Bible, go to the book of Malachi. Malachi, one of the prophets. The prophets loved to thunder. What a lovely thought, to be able to thunder forth. And they spoke with the voice of God. They thought they were able to do so, that they were free to do so. And this is what the prophet Malachi says to the children of Israel, speaking as though he were God himself. If you will return to me, I will return to you, saith the Lord of hosts. You ask, how can we return? May man defraud God that you defraud me? You ask, how have we defrauded thee? Why, in tithes and contributions. There is a curse on all of you, I say, the whole nation of you, because you have defrauded me. Bring now the tithes into the treasury, all of them. Let there be food in my house. Put me to the proof, and see if I do not open the windows of the sky and pour a blessing on you, as long as there is a need, if you tithe. Well, that's a thunderous prophecy, is it not? From a prophet who was very good at thundering. Jesus, about 450, 500 years later, put it a little more eloquently and a little more softly when he said, in effect, as you give, so shall you receive. As you give, it's in Luke 6:38, as you give, so shall it be returned unto you. rather beautiful, because the notion of the tithe became well established in the Jewish religion. Initially, when we read that passage, we understand that it was necessary for the survival of the people, for those who grew the grain, to bring a portion of it into the storehouse, so that during times of famine, everybody would survive. It was a very practical measure. By the time Jesus' day has been reached, agriculture has to some degree stabilized. There's more predictability about the food that will be grown and will be available. And so Jesus has moved the principle onto a more abstract level. But it's still there. And he says, give, because as you give to the source, give to God, so too you shall receive. That is why the notion of giving is so powerfully established in the Jewish religion today, as indeed it is in the Islamic religion. It's there as well, because Muhammad, blessed be his name, insisted that those who followed him should give for the benefit of widows and orphans. It's a strongly established principle. But we today in this country benefit enormously, do we not, from the generosity of our Jewish friends in the community. Many of our museums, our concert halls, our symphony orchestras exist because Jewish people have given them to us, following fundamentally the same injunction that Jesus gives, knowing that as they themselves give, so too shall they benefit. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the notion of the tithe became a little more mechanistic, shall I say. There wasn't the possibility of famine. There was a degree of support for the widows and orphans. But in the 19th and especially the 20th centuries, the early 20th centuries, the notion of the tithe was again transmuted, and it formed a part of the minister's salary. Seems strange in a sense, but in the memory of my grandparents, and indeed of my parents, there was still this idea of people bringing sacks of grain or sides of ham to pay the minister's stipend. Don't do this for me. I don't really want to drag sacks of grain in the elevator up to my room in the hotel where I'm staying, and I don't know what I would do with a side of ham. But quite recently, this was the notion. The minister's support was provided by his parishioners who gave of their produce to support him. And then, of course, there are even today churches, many churches, that insist that their parishioners, their congregants, actually tithe money from their income. You will say gross or net. I'm not sure which. I imagine the pastor might say gross and the parishioner might say net, but I'm not sure how that would go on. I cut this little squib from a Florida paper not so long ago. It says, "Man gets refund of church tithes." I'm going to change the names to protect the innocent. The man who sued his church claiming he didn't get his money's worth actually got a refund on Wednesday. Hugh, let's call him Hugh Smith, said he was happy after receiving his check. Smith of Miami had sued his church for tithes he donated in response to the pastor's promise that blessings, benefits, and rewards would come to a person who gave 10% of his wealth. Doesn't say whether that was net or gross. After 2 years, Smith said he had not received blessings, benefits, nor rewards. Well, Fortunately, the judge before whom the case initially came said that this issue was a matter of faith, and that in any case one shouldn't bargain with God. What a very sensible judge that really is, or must have been. But many of us still have it in our minds, or we may have come from churches where this was the case. Many of us still have it in our minds that somehow there's something special, holy, dedicated about that 10%. 10% of our income should go to our church or to some other source of our good. And we work to achieve that. Now, let me say this immediately, that if it were not for some of you tithing to this church, we would not be able to sustain the ministry that we do. We're immensely grateful, all of us, to those of you who actually tithe to this church. Do you know we have no other source of income whatsoever save your generosity? There is no diocese waiting to bail us out should we need help. There is no Methodist conference that will slip us 30 grand if we find ourselves embarrassed. You, by your free will gifts and offerings, by your tithes, support this ministry. It's an amazing phenomenon. I have a friend who is an Anglican priest up in Clearwater here on the mainland, on the other side of the mainland anyway. And he said, I couldn't work the way you do. He said, I couldn't live with the uncertainty. He said, I have to have some sort of secure knowledge of what's going to come in. I have another acquaintance who's the treasurer of a large Baptist church in the same state, in Florida. And he doesn't have any problem with his budget at all. He knows how much is going to come in because it's already been pledged and tithed. He knows what's going to come in. There may be a few little bits of icing on the cake, the odd bequest here and there, and the special gift, but he knows what's going to come. He says, I couldn't operate the way you people do with this problematic income. That's why it's so difficult sometimes for us to make up a budget. We know what's going to go out, but we can't really tell what's going to come in. We don't actually know what people are going to give on Sunday or at any other time. That's up to you, wonderful people, to decide what you want to give. And some of you tithe. And praise God that you do. We appreciate that. But what I'd like to do this morning is to look at the fundamental spiritual principle that underlies the concept of the tithe and to perhaps move it away from the quantitative. You see, spiritual principles are qualitative. You can't measure a spiritual principle. You can measure an actual 10% tithe. I suppose if you gave it in gold coin, we might weigh it as well. Wouldn't that be fun? Do we have a balance in the office so we can... Good idea. If any of you would like to give gold sovereigns as part of your tithe, we would appreciate that. But the principle behind tithing is just that. It is a spiritual principle, and it can't be measured, and it can't be weighed. It is not to be quantitatively analyzed. It is a quality. And the tithe really means this, as Jesus says in Luke, as you give, so you receive. Don't limit yourself. That's what he's saying. As you give, so you receive. I've had people who've come to me and said, I would love to tithe, but I really don't have the money at the moment. I'm not sure I can take 10% out of what I owe. I say, well, that's all right. But what have you to give? What have you to give? What is uniquely yours to give back to the world, to God, your Maker? And that's a surprise to them sometimes. They say, oh, well, just a minute. There are so many things that we can give back, so many qualities that we have. You know the best gift of all? Do you know the best gift of all that you can give to the world and to your fellow human beings? Hands up. Come on. Yourself, right? You are your best gift to the world. Some people say, me, little me, I've nothing to give. Everybody has something to give. A beautiful voice, a warm handshake, a word of encouragement. It's going to sound like the Boy Scouts in a minute. I don't care. We all can give of ourselves. And the more we give, the more the return comes. This is an indubitable spiritual principle that I have proven in my own life. I don't ask you to prove it in yours if you don't want to, and I don't promise anything. I'm not going to get sued like the church in Florida for promising anything as a result. Try it and see. It works. It really works. I had a friend who's a biologist who told me not so long ago that if we take all the water out of the human body, wouldn't that be wonderful if we could do that? Those of us who would like to take some water out of the human body, if we took all the water out of the human body, and if we were sort of ground down, as it were, to our fundamental chemical bases, the chemicals that resulted would be worth about $10 on the open market. That's all we're worth, actually, folks. About $10 on the open market. Not worth that much when you really get down to it. But contrast that with what we can do when we're alive, when we're sentient beings. We have an infinity of possibility before us. There's so much that we can give of ourselves. Why limit it? Why limit it to something that is measurable, quantifiable, that boils down to the 10% that we have been told sometimes is the essence of the tithe? Why bind it with that constriction? I had a friend, and I told some folk about him at the earlier services, a German individual, man who lived in a northern German town, I think it was Hamburg, and he lived there during the war. He's long since passed, but he lived there during the war when it was being cruelly bombed by the Allies. Hamburg was reduced really almost to rubble. But he lived on the 6th floor of an apartment which managed to survive the Blitz, the Allied Blitz at least, and he was an accountant. He was very proud of his profession and his ability as an accountant. And he was also a member of the Lutheran Church, which is, in effect, the state church of Germany, just as the Anglican Church is the state church in England. And the church, or at least his particular parish, demanded that its congregants pay the tithe, 10% of their earnings. That's what the church asked for. And this individual found it increasingly difficult to live up to this commitment as the war progressed. In fact, he was obliged for several months to work without any salary at all. He was barely able to feed himself, and this troubled him because he had always been deeply committed to the production of that 10% tithe. In fact, he used to say, when he came home from work on Friday evenings, he would sit down and very carefully calculate the exact amount that he owed his church. He would sit there for maybe 5, 10, 15 minutes and work it all out. But he wasn't able to do that anymore because he wasn't earning any money. And yet he felt this powerful desire, this strong inner need, this intuitive sense, which really was so strong that it permeated his being. This feeling that he had to give back. That even though he didn't seem to be getting anything, he nevertheless needed to give back in some way. It was part in his mind, and the Germans think very logically. Thank you, Germans, if you're watching. We admire and appreciate your abilities in that field. At least I do. His logical mind said, giving and receiving, they're part of an axiomatic spiritual principle. As we give, so we do receive. And he began to think, How can I give? And what can I give? I mean, here's a man sitting in a bombed-out city at the top of an apartment building, which is probably going to be next on the list of some bomber up above. He's not earning any money. He's starving pretty much. He wants to tithe. What can he do? You know what he did? He was an amateur pianist, and he had one of those beautiful German pianos, a Bechstein or a Blüthner, and he had the piano carried down by some friends of his, some men friends of his, carried down into the street. Now you must envisage the street. It's covered in dust most of the time. There's rubble everywhere. Most of the buildings around have been demolished already. And yet he had the piano placed in the middle of the street, and he sat there, and every day, because most of the bombing was at night, every day when the inhabitants of the city had crawled from the bomb shelters, terrified many of them, every day he would play for them on this piano in the middle of the street. He would play Chopin, he would play Bach, he would play Beethoven, he would play Liszt, anything he could remember. And people sat and they were enthralled. And for a few moments, his gift raised them from the horror of the lives that they were enduring. Now tell me, is this or is this not a tithe? Is this or is this not a fulfillment of the principle that as we give, so we receive? He was giving. He had found a way. In the midst of that unimaginable horror, he'd found a way to give of himself. As it happened after the war, he gave up his profession of accountancy and became a piano teacher and flourished hugely as a result. I suppose somebody helped him get the darn piano upstairs, and luckily his apartment building was still standing in 1945. But you see, he had sensed intuitively, perhaps because he had been driven to sense, he had sensed intuitively that this is the nature of the spiritual principle. We don't confine it to 10%, gross or net, of what we earn. We may. It's a wonderful thing to do. But let's not leave the principle there. Let's not isolate it, confine it. Let's allow it to spread its wings, as it were, qualitatively, and say to us, as I give, so I receive. Every one of us in this room, every one of us may give in ways that only he or she may give. I don't know what those ways are. It's not my business to know, but you know. Every one of us is capable of an act, a word, a gesture that can be construed as giving back to that which gave us life. We have people in this church who volunteer. That's a tithe. That's a form of giving. And how deeply we appreciate it. And how greatly we celebrate it, not for ourselves, but for you. Because as you give, so you receive. What do you receive? What do you want? I don't know. I'm not going to tell you to get a pink Cadillac if you come here 3 times a week and serve in the thrift store. Do you want a pink Cadillac? I don't know. Maybe if you sell cosmetics, you'll get a pink Cadillac. But that's got nothing to do with God. We don't make bargains with our Maker. We don't make bargains with God. We give out of our abundance, out of the abundance of life itself. Money, yes, if we have it. But we give. That's the important point. As you give, so you flourish, so you grow, and so the good comes back to you. Jesus says this. He uses the metaphor of the winepress. He says, when you give, the return comes pressed down and running over It does work that way. But we have to prove it ourselves. It does work. As we give of ourselves, from ourselves, so we receive. So it is written. And I believe, so it is.